Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the first webinar of the Let's Talk About Resilience webinar series. This series is a partnership between the GTM Research Reserve, the Northeast Florida Regional Council, and WJCT's ADAPT. This webinar series will focus on local and regional resiliency efforts in Northeast Florida, where our invited speakers will present and share their efforts in helping communities prepare for the impacts of sea level rise and coastal flooding. My name is Abigail Kuhn, and I am the Coastal Training Program Specialist at the GTM Research Reserve, and I will be moderating questions and introducing our speakers today. As a quick reminder, please leave your audio muted. I don't see anyone's videos on right now, but if you do choose to turn your video on, we are recording this webinar, so just be mindful of your background. Today we will be using the chat box to moderate questions, which you can find in your Zoom control bar. You can also view other participants in the participants box. And then you may also leave nonverbal feedback under the reactions tab. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online once it is processed. So our first speaker today is Dr. Samantha Chapman. Dr. Chapman has been a professor and scientist at Villanova University in Pennsylvania since 2007. She is also currently the co-director of the Center for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stewardship and runs the Wet Feet Project. Dr. Chapman received her PhD from Northern Arizona University and did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. She is an ecosystem ecologist who is interested in how climate change and altered biodiversity change the services that ecosystems provide. Sam and her team collaborate to understand how climate change and rising sea levels alter coastal ecosystems. So Sam, take it away.
Great. So I'm really excited to kick off this webinar series with my great colleague, Christine Angelini. It's always fun to hear about all the cool things she's doing and to be in the same spaces with her, even virtually. And thanks to Abby for organizing this. I'm excited. This is, the first of 5 of these webinars, and I'm excited to go to the other ones because they sound really great and interesting and important for this region. So today I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on really over the past, I guess, almost a year, called Experimenting with Elevation. And this is with my co-collaborators, including Caitlin Dietz, Nikki Dix, Greg Berutez, Tess Adji, Adam Langley, and Leah Sampson. And I wanted to thank, in addition to Abby, some other people at the GTM Research Reserve and some other people at Villanova for collaborating with me on this work as well. This project's funded by the National Estuarine Research Reserve System Science Collaborative and is a partnership with the GTM Reserve. So the way that this project sort of came about, to give you a little bit of an idea of its nexus, is that as Abby said, I've been running this Wet Feet project over the past few years that's funded by NSF to try to understand how the increasing number of mangroves in Northeast Florida is influencing surface elevation in the coastal wetlands there. And we're looking at both using experiments at a variety of sites, using these open top chambers and lots of different kinds of measurements. We're figuring out how both mangrove encroachment and warming are influencing the process of surface elevation. And the reason this sort of led to the project I'm going to talk to you about today is that we're measuring surface elevation and we're modeling how surface elevation is going to change in the future with rising sea levels. And, you sort of get to that point in your data collection where you're like, okay, well, this is really going to happen. What are we going to do about it? And I credit Nikki Dix for always asking that question. And so she and I at a conference had an idea to work on this proposal to look at potential solutions and ways in which we can maintain surface elevation in the wetlands of the GTM NER. And so that, of course, in order to understand solutions, which is the focus for a lot of this webinar, we need to understand vulnerability. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a step back today and tell you about how we've been assessing coastal vulnerability in the GTM NER in order to understand these various restoration strategies that we can impose to assist with maintaining surface elevation, or the amount of sort of elevation with respect to sea level that allows these ecosystems to be resilient, as well as the populations that live behind and around them to be resilient as well. So there are 4 different site-specific, that's the theme of today, restoration strategies that we've been looking at, and I'll get back to them at the end. But just to explain what these 4 strategies are and to allow you to see what they are so that we have context for the vulnerability assessment. They are mangrove establishment, which is happening naturally in Northeast Florida, as many of you know, due to the lack of freeze events. And this is where woody mangrove trees are moving into salt marsh ecosystems, and that changes lots of things about the structure of the ecosystem, including potentially changing the amount of coastal protection that they provide, as well as the amount of surface elevation that they maintain. Another one that most of you are probably familiar with are living shorelines, which are various structures that are alive, such as an oyster reef is a great example, to actually provide, again, protection for human infrastructure and wetlands against rising seas and big storms. Another type of restoration that's been used a lot in other parts of Florida, although not as much in Northeast Florida, is landform modification, where berms are being removed that had hydrological manipulations for things like mosquito control, which of course is not present as much in Northeast Florida. Upland redistribution, smoothing of spoil islands, so actually changing the shape of the land so that surface elevation can change, and therefore potentially be maintained at a point where the wetlands can have feedbacks that can sustain itself so it stays above sea level and then protects inland infrastructure. And then the last one, which my colleague, Christine Angelini, is going to talk about more later, is thin layer sediment deposition. And she knows a lot more about this than me. And so I'll leave most of the discussion of this to her. But the idea that we're actually placing sediment on wetlands to, again, give them a little boost in the face of sea level rise to help them keep up. It's, of course, the case that combinations of these strategies are often necessary in order to actually do a restoration project that works. So the goals of the project that we've been working on is to identify portions of the reserve that are particularly vulnerable to habitat loss due to both either low elevation or vulnerability in some other way, from big boat wakes or wind-driven waves or something like that, and I'll talk about that. The second goal is to engage land managers and scientists in a new collaboration to investigate these management options that I just told you about that could potentially help us to sort of increase surface elevation so that these wetlands could be more resilient in the face of sea level rise. So how did we actually get to determine vulnerable sites in the reserve, which takes up a large portion of the wetlands in a section of Northeast Florida? We used a coastal vulnerability index that I'll tell you about in a minute at the same time as we were actually doing expert opinion-based screening. So actually asking people that are out on the water all of the time, in boats, people at ecotourism companies, people that work at the reserve, and others, where they think are vulnerable sites. And then we looked at sort of where the overlap is between these 2 data sets of what potentially vulnerable sites are. And then our sort of next steps are applying suitability analyses of these sites that we identify as vulnerable, and then determining site-specific restoration strategies. And so I'll really be talking about most today, sort of this first part of the process in the next few minutes. So the coastal vulnerability index that we used was the natural capital product, which is called the INVEST model. And what this INVEST model can do is it can assess the role of natural habitats in protecting the coastal assets of the GTM NER. So these natural habitats include salt marshes, oyster beds, and mangroves. And these existing habitats have different properties in terms of wave attenuation, in terms of the threats that are threatening them, and in terms of the co-benefits that they can provide, both in terms of carbon storage and fisheries and water purification, et cetera. We also, in addition to habitat layers, which are in this index, we also have other layers which we apply various ranks to. And I just want to emphasize these ranks are relative, right, to each other. So I'll give you an example, a low elevation relative to a high elevation marsh, or a mangrove versus an oyster. And we give these relative ranks to each of these layers and then lay them on top of each other to get at coastal vulnerability. So things like geomorphology, elevation, and natural habitats, as well as structures that line the intercoastal waterway and line the wetlands, are layers that go into this coastal vulnerability index. Other things that are considered are, of course, wave exposure, and these are local wind-generated waves, the surge potential, and this is based on a Category 3 storm, as well as boat wake exposure. And I want to talk about that for a second because it's been kind of a tricky one that we've been working on, and we think we've done some pretty neat things with trying to get at boat wake exposure in parts of the reserve. And so my student, Philip Yang, had this great idea to during this pandemic, it's been challenging to actually get out to these places and interview people about what they think the boat wake exposure is at various marinas and other places on these small tidal creeks where there's not as much data. And so Phil came up with this idea to use participatory GIS. And so he made this app in which people could go into the app for places within the reserve that they know and fish in or are familiar with in some other way, and actually put in what they see as the potential boat wakes in that area. And so you see an output of that participatory GIS app that he has here. And so we used this interview data in addition to this PGIS. And so the interview data is the one I was talking about earlier, where we're actually getting assessments from people that are familiar with these waterways. And we combined that with a model that we use to predict boat wake height using AIS data. So actually shipping data, boat data that's from the main channel of the intercoastal waterway. And this includes where the boats are, what their speed is, what their length is. And then we finally also used this boat wake exposure based on estimated wave heights, distance of the source to shore, sort of the width of the channel, and the density of the vessel traffic. So we put all these different data sources together to get at the boat wake exposure variable. And this is helpful because it gives us boat wake data, not just for the main intercoastal waterway, but also for these small tidal creeks that are often ignored. And yet the wetlands along them can be, can suffer problems from boat wakes just as much as the main channel. And so what this model can help us do, and what you're seeing here is just a readout of essentially what type of coastal exposure we can see with the habitats that I just talked about, oysters, mangroves, and marshes, versus without those habitats. And the red areas are more vulnerable, and the blue areas are less vulnerable. And so as you are not surprised, habitats, of course, lead to protection against coastal vulnerability. But the nice thing about this model is we can pull in and out these different layers and see how much each of them contributes to coastal vulnerability. How much does the elevation of a site? How much do boat wakes contribute to it? How much do the habitat contribute to it? And so it can really allow us to kind of drill through these maps and get at this site is vulnerable, but which of these layers is making it most vulnerable? Is it the waves? Is it edge structures? Those kinds of things. And so these are just some other, this is the big readout of the GTM Reserve's coastal vulnerability. This is a model run that we just completed in September. And this is a lot of work by Greg Verutez, my collaborator on this project. And what you can see here is the different sections of the reserve have different vulnerabilities. And if you blow this up, you see, again, we have blue, which is lower vulnerability, red, which is higher vulnerability. You can look at certain sites and really dig into places that expert opinion showed were vulnerable, that were also showing up as vulnerable using this index. Remember those kind of two parallel streams of data that I was talking about. And so you can see around here, around some marinas, there tends to be a lot of vulnerability. Around some state parks where there's a lot of boat traffic, there tends to be some vulnerability. But you can also see that even within a small stretch of coastline, you get places that are very vulnerable, as indicated in the red, and much less vulnerable, as indicated in the blue. And what these circles are that you're seeing on the map here are actually places where there was boat wake data that was given either in these interviews or using the app to sort of give us an idea of where we might think boat wakes might be playing into this vulnerability as well. And so now that we have this map, we were able to sort of explore our second goal of this project, which is to actually bring people together in workshops and talk about what to do about the vulnerability. So the first workshop, we heard restoration stories from people like Christine and her team of work that's actually being done in Northeast Florida for people that are actually practitioners of these restoration techniques. And we identified some knowledge gaps for restoration planning within the reserve. And then as you're seeing here in these images, in our second workshop, we actually went out to a bunch of these vulnerable sites that were identified as vulnerable, either through expert opinion or through the index, and visited them to figure out what we could see on the ground was making them vulnerable. And then we went back to the reserve and had some discussions about restoration. And so you can see us here standing on one of these oyster rakes, behind which there seems to be a section that showed up as being pretty vulnerable in our indices. And this makes sense because there's kind of this hydrological barrier, which is not allowing for tide water to be delivered and things to be flushing in this marsh. And so there can be a buildup behind this rake of sulfides and things like this. And so this might be one of the reasons why this site showed up as being vulnerable. So in this second workshop, which just happened, so we're still kind of processing it, we did this site visit, like I told you about. We discussed imagery history of these sites that showed up to be vulnerable, what the drivers were, using those maps as I showed you and saying, like, this site seems to be more vulnerable potentially because of this oyster rake or because of the boat wake data here, because it just has a really low elevation. And thinking about when we looked at those sites, what could be some logistics for restoration in each of these places. And then we kind of sat around with the maps, as you can see a picture here, and looked at places that perhaps weren't showing up using the index and why they weren't showing up. And so we thought about that. And then finally, we did this great flip chart activity that Caitlin came up with to actually explore these restoration strategies for vulnerable sites. So thinking about if we were to, do some sort of landform modification in this site, what would be the logistics of that? How that might affect other things that are part of the reserve's mission, including habitat for other organisms, or how would this affect mosquito control personnel and their mission, or how would this affect Parks and Rec? And so again, this is the importance of bringing in all of these different voices to these conversations, is to think about different people's priorities for these landscapes. And so some emergent themes to finish off were that boat wakes do seem to play a large role in vulnerability, perhaps not surprising, and that those may not always be happening in the places we had thought. Some of this hydrological disruption by things like oyster rakes might also be driving vulnerability and marsh stress in the reserve. Thin layer, a couple of our stakeholders were from the Army Corps, and they thought that in certain places it wasn't feasible to use thin layer placement. And luckily we'll hear more about that from Christine, which is good to know because, in some places this could be a possibility for these wetlands, but in some places it can't. And it was good to sort of get some input on where this could happen and could happen due to a lack of dredging in those areas. We identified some knowledge gaps that we have, including how nutrients are influencing these wetlands, how mangrove facilitation might work, and the implications for other organisms. And then finally, we think that this habitat value that we're getting out of the vulnerability index might allow for prioritization by reserve staff for various habitats. Like this place actually is not vulnerable. So maybe this is a place where we really need to think about doing some conservation or really monitoring this site so that it doesn't have any problems with sea level rise going forward. And so I just want to wrap up and saying what our next steps are. As I told you, we're going to think about these sites that are being prioritized for conservation and restoration and think about suitability for various restoration techniques. We're going to actually do elevation surveys of those sites that end up being prioritized and then start to sort of integrate some other stakeholder preferences, thinking at things like education and visitation and recreational use of these sites, and think about some ecosystem service trade-off analyses. And so with that, hopefully, Abby, I didn't go too far over. I'd be happy to take any questions at the end, right, Abby, in the chat?
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Yes, we will wait till the very end for questions, but if you have any questions immediately right now for Dr. Chapman, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll come back to them. But thank you, Dr. Chapman, for that great presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Christine Angelini. Dr. Angelini is an assistant professor in environmental in the environmental engineering sciences. She received her PhD in biology from the University of Florida in 2014 and her Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from Brown University in 2009. She is an ecologist with expertise in wetland, reef, and dune systems, and her research focuses on advancing mechanistic understanding of how species interactions moderate ecosystem resilience to climate change and influence contaminant integration into food webs. So Dr. Angelini, take it away.
Great, thanks a lot. Nice to not see everybody, but at least see your names and hopefully hear from you in the question and answer period after this. So I'm really, it's very well crafted by Abby to have me going after Sam, because I think her overview is a really nice setup for some of the things I'm going to talk about in my presentation. So I'm going to be sharing with you all today an overview of some of the progress that myself and the project team, which I'll share on the next slide, has been making, that's really focused on how do we basically restore and enhance the spatial coverage and stability of our marshes and mangroves within the GTM Research Reserve region, in Northeast Florida around St. Augustine, in such a way that we can, reuse dredge sediments, maintain the navigation function of major boating channels like the Intercoastal Waterway, and simultaneously protect kind of critical coastal community infrastructure. And how might we approach these types of challenges in our particular region of the world, where we have unique sedimentation dynamics and hydrology and the ecology of our system that means that we need local knowledge and local insights to inform how we do such management here. So first to get started, the project I'm going to be talking about today is really a collaboration that involves other faculty from the University of Florida in terms of Todd Osborne, who you may know as an expert in sort of biogeochemical cycling and coastal ecology from the UF Whitney Lab. We have several colleagues from Wood Engineering that bring in expertise on sort of the environmental engineering side of things, a collaborator from the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as a number of folks that are locally working in your estuaries day in and day out. Caitlin, who many of you know from other stakeholder events, Nikki, who's the Research Reserve Director, Scott, who works for DEP, and finally Jessica from the city of St. Augustine. So this has been a sort of well orchestrated and very collaborative project that I'm going to be sharing with you today, but it's really come from kind of the collective knowledge of this group and others that we've brought in, including a number of partners that are coming from the Anastasia Mosquito Control District, input from the Matanzas Riverkeeper, folks that are on the ground doing coastal restoration work from Florida Fish and Wildlife and St. John River Water Management District, the local Jacksonville District of the Corps, and find. So just know that kind of we've been well supported by a broader community that we all know it takes a village to make change and make the change we want to see in our coastal systems. So Sam mentioned this to some extent in her talk, but I'm really going to be focusing on our coastal, or the vegetated parts of our coastal landscape, particularly our salt marshes and our mangroves. And the reason is that not only does NIFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as many stakeholders in our community, we care about the sort of preserving our vegetated coastal ecosystems, because they provide really important shoreline protection services to upstream sort of or landward infrastructure in the way that they are able to dissipate storm surge and wave action, but also naturally accrete and keep pace with sea level rise and provide a natural sort of biogenic barrier to those dimensions of climate change. So the vegetated, parts of our coastline are good at naturally doing this. But as Sam alluded to, we know very well that in this region of the world that these landscapes are particularly vulnerable to a few kind of critical threats that are going to be the focus of this talk. The first is coming from basically lateral loss of these landscapes. We're literally losing them from the lower intertidal edges of the intercoastal waterway as that boat traffic sort of gradually eats away at the lateral margins of our marshes. But if you look at these landscapes from the top down, we're also losing our vegetated systems because of interior ponding and essentially fragmentation of the interior areas of the marshes, which you can see, kind of in the central area of this picture here. So essentially, as we lose the habitats, we're losing the shoreline protection services of these coastal landscapes as well. So some of the approaches that are being taken to sort of sustain our coastal wetlands and to combat this kind of interior drowning and ponding of our marshes, an approach that's really kind of gaining momentum and visibility across the United States and internationally is this idea of taking material that's getting dredged out of our waterways to maintain navigation and using piping and other forms of sort of transportation of that source material and applying it in what they call thin layers on the surfaces of our marshes in a way that it gives the marshes kind of what we call elevation capital, sort of gives them a boost in elevation. And the idea is that over time, that kind of thin layer application gets integrated into the kind of, vegetated fabric of these landscapes. And it's a way of not only keeping the waterways clear for navigation, but also to give the vegetated landscapes kind of an elevation boost. And in some cases, as you can see in the picture in the bottom left, these areas where sediments have been applied to the landscape can kind of be capped, if you will, by sediment control devices, which in the picture here from New Jersey, is a pile of riprap that's along the lower intertidal margins that essentially keeps that that sediment in place and gives the vegetation time to colonize it and transform this region into sort of or sustain a salt marsh in this particular location. So we're really interested in Northeast Florida and exploring this type of technique. But another possible solution that we could be using in tandem or in concert with thin layer placement is this idea of putting out semi-permeable barriers, which could look like a variety of different things. But the goal of this type of an approach would be to place such structures on the lower intertidal margins of our marshes to combat that lateral loss that we see as the marshes basically peel back in response to that vessel traffic. So this is an example of a project that our team conducted with FWC in the St. John River Water Management District in North Peninsula State Park, which is just south of where many of you are. And this was a location where these entities were losing a restored salt marsh that they had put a lot of time and energy and effort into restoring because of erosion from boat wakes, and they were able to put in these semi-permeable barriers as well as oyster reefs and plantings in order to sort of regain some of the marsh they had lost and stabilize the system. So we're interested in the context of our project and in whether we can apply these types of approaches and how we might plan such a project at scale. So we're particularly focused on a project location. You can kind of get oriented here in sort of the center of St. Johns County as a kind of reference. This is State Road 312. And the critical kind of infrastructure just upstream of the marshes that we're really focused on include the Flagler Hospital, a consortium of residential properties, as well as a medical office complex. And all of these this type of kind of infrastructure is being protected from storm surge and wave action by the marshes that line the intercoastal waterway that you see sort of bisecting our site. So our project is really focused on quantifying, what have been the historic rates of salt marsh and shoreline change at this site. Is this a location where we have evidence that basically the system is unstable and gradually deteriorating? And if so, where in this landscape is that degradation happening particularly quickly? And then thinking about these interventions, what are some of the project constraints and opportunities? Both in sort of from the broader stakeholder community, but then also how do we think about permitting such a project moving forward? And then we really are kind of focusing on understanding what's in the salt marshes now and as they sort of gradually transition into mangroves. So we have a great idea of kind of what these systems look like before any type of intervention takes place. What are the sediment portfolio look like both at our sites as well as our source materials? And so do we feel comfortable with applying dredge sediments onto our marshes in such a way that we're not amplifying contamination or something like that? And then finally, our project concludes with a preliminary project design. And this is this project started in August of this past year and will run through August of 2022. So this is the activities we're pursuing in collaboration over this time period. So this is just a brief overview of some of the work that we've done so far related to this project. So first and foremost, we've been quantifying what have been the historic rates of salt marsh change. So both the interior areas of the marsh, as well as the lateral edges of the marsh of that line, the intercoastal waterway. And we've been doing this by comparing kind of the marsh spatial extent in aerial photographs in the period spanning 2005 to 2021, although the data I'm going to show you today is just up till 2015. We haven't added the new data layer yet. And we're also collecting really high resolution data related to the rates and patterns of this kind of peeling off of the marsh edges from the intercoastal waterway using a technique called terrestrial laser scanning. And for brevity today, I'm not going to share with you those results, but it's giving us a really strong sense of how quickly and in what way are we seeing lateral loss of these marshes. All right, so here's some data that shows you essentially each one of the data points as you go from right to left is one of these transect lines that you see running along the kind of center line of the intercoastal waterway, and positive values in this chart indicate that the channel has been widening, and this is so on the y-axis. This is the average width of the average change in channel width per year in meters per year. And so positive values mean that the intercoastal waterway is widening, and negative values would indicate that the intercoastal waterway is narrowing. And what we see is across this focal region, almost universally, we're seeing expansion of the intercoastal waterway, and the channel is widening at an average rate of about 0.7 meters per year. So that's about 2 feet per year that this channel is widening. And if you imagine that happening over several decades, that's many, many feet on both sides of the intercoastal that we're losing salt marsh and mangrove habitat. So if we look at kind of patterns of marsh change in the interior areas of the marshes, this is what is shown in this picture. So this is an image that shows you the marsh change in this period of 2005 to 2014. In gray are areas that haven't changed in area. In red is where we lost marsh in this period, and in green is where we've gained marsh across this landscape. And don't worry too much about the numbers. These are just kind of regions and quadrants where we see sort of slightly different behavior across this kind of landscape. But in general, even over this kind of relatively short 9-year period, in some of our regions, we've lost more than 6% of the total marsh area. This is what's going on in region 6 here, as a result largely of this interior ponding and sort of opening up of the interior areas of these marshes, which is generally indicative of this kind of the phenomenon of the marshes drowning and not keeping pace with sea level rise. We're gradually losing them from their lower intertidal edges, as you can kind of see from the depiction of where the red is on these kind of existing patches. And just for reference, like our time zero for this analysis is already kind of on a marsh that's already significantly affected. We've managed to track down some historical images, or not images, but maps of this region from 1860. This is the same exact spot where we are doing our work. And you can see that historically, there was large contiguous areas of high marsh and lower marsh habitat throughout this region. And now we're really in this kind of Swiss cheese state. So just for context, the comparative analysis that I just showed is already, on top of a pretty impacted landscape. And so when we think about what our targets are for restoration, we may want to be thinking further back in terms of the historical record. So we've conducted a stakeholder workshop to begin to understand, what can we do to better maintain these marshes, and are our approaches of thin layer placement and these kind of lower intertidal semi-permeable breaks a potential option as an intervention in this particular location to stabilize and potentially augment these marshes. And so this is a brief summary of some of the things that came out of our workshop. Stakeholders indicated certain, concerns about whether if we were to apply dredge sediments to gain salt marsh, would we end up losing oyster habitat that's established in these kind of lower intertidal mudflat areas? We discovered concerns about basically land ownership of the salt marshes. So in the figure that you see on the right-hand side, you can see who owns the land on the eastern margin of the intercoastal waterway in our study region. And what's really kind of fascinating about this is that there's private ownership shown in sort of blue and in orange, that these are not actually state-owned lands. And so when we think about how we're going to get permissions to do thin layer placement, we really have to think about those kind of underlying land ownership sort of challenges. We realize that this site is, of course, very visible to local property owners. And so trying to develop strategies for how do we get buy-in from these landowners, that local interventions that may temporarily look ugly may actually buy them time and enhance their sort of storm surge protection value that they get from their marshes. But this is also potentially a constraint. We have major challenges with understanding the basic hydrology and sediment transport that's happening in these marshes. So if we implemented such techniques, where would the water and the sediment ultimately go? And can we predict that with a high enough accuracy to make such a project something that we're comfortable with? But we also found some great opportunities with this project. So as we came to realize from FIND, the Florida Inland Navigation District, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to find like dredging projects that are coming up where we can grab those sediments and apply them to the marshes. But this region of Florida actually has significant amounts of sediment that are stockpiled in what's called DMMAs, or dredge material management areas. And so those are locations where we're very likely to find sediments suitable for application. And we have ideas about how we can replace displaced oysters should we need to do so through our project. So these are a couple of our opportunities, and we have some major research needs moving forward, in particular in understanding what the kind of background levels of water quality in this region, how they may be affecting the health and the stability of these marshes, and how that kind of background stress condition may ultimately affect the trajectory or success of such projects. That seems like a big outstanding concern, as well as how different wildlife and overall biodiversity of this site might be affected. So our next step in terms of engaging stakeholders is having a pre-permitting meeting, and Caitlin Dietz is going to be a kind of very instrumental in supporting this. So I realize I'm getting short on time, so I'm going to just skip through the next couple of slides and just say that we've been collecting really high resolution information about what the baseline conditions are in terms of the ecology and the sediment that are in these sites. We've been evaluating again where we could source dredge material and what the conditions are in our marshes. And preliminary results indicate that there aren't any contaminants occurring at particularly concerning levels in the salt marshes at our site from the analysis that we've done so far. And we're now sampling dredge material that's stored at these DMMAs to see whether it would be suitable for application on our marsh site. So can we essentially find a match between the source of dredge material and the locations where we're going to place it. And moving forward, by August of next year, we'll be preparing preliminary engineering designs for this project that will, articulate where we would apply the dredge sediments and build the break walls, how much material we would be adding, where we would source it, how we would bring it to the site, what the projected costs are, and finally, how would we monitor the success of such a project. So just so you know, this type of work is kind of moving forward. We're really thinking about the engineering, the science, and the stakeholder engagement that's really needed to pull off a project like this. And we have another project that's kind of spinning up that's sponsored by the Army Corps of Engineers that's going to allow us to really do some of the science that we've identified as research needs in this project. So I won't say too much more about that, but between now and ultimately getting to final engineering designs, the University of Florida has an interdisciplinary team that's coming together to work on understanding the hydrology, the sediment transport, and better projecting this sort of environmental response to these interventions. So with that, I'll close up, and hopefully we have plenty of time for some back and forth and questions. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Angelini. That was a great presentation and a great overview of a really exciting project. So we do have one comment in the chat box so far. Caitlin Wood asks, I know creation of new no wake or low wake zones isn't exactly a simple process, but if there are clear impacts from boat wake, would there be any case for trying to create a wake regulated zone or doing something like that rather than continually trying to restore or add material to that area? Is it more focused on removal or mediation of the stressor rather than on the result?
Do you want to go, Sam? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to hear what you think. But so one thing we just talked about at our workshop is, strangely the worst wakes, right, come from like medium speeds, right? When people are planing, is actually lower wakes. And so it was, we almost had this crazy idea of, regulating wakes. This was just sort of a thought experiment to be high or no wake, right? Rather than kind of at this plowing speed. So I don't know, I think that was a really interesting idea, but those are the wakes. And yeah, I mean, I know that is a very difficult thing to regulate, particularly along the main channel, where, people are moving their big boats. So I don't know, I'd be curious to see what Christine thinks too.
Yeah, so we've been working on these boat wake challenges since I started my faculty position, because when we talked to Caitlin and well, I guess Caitlin wasn't in her position then, but Nikki Dix and other folks at the NER, we asked, what is the biggest kind of threat that you have to your marshes? And the answer was, we think it's the boats. We think it's the fact that the boats are sort of totally transforming the climate, the energy, like the hydrodynamic climate in our otherwise low energy systems, and causing them, basically causing this extra stress that our wetlands can't handle. And so we've been working on this for some time. And as we've talked to different regulators over the years, essentially the function of these channels in terms of supporting navigation is such a high priority, both in terms of the local tourism economy, as well as the commercial sort of traffic, that boats, there's no way we're not going to have boats in these regions. And the stretches we're talking about are miles long within, that go down sort of the throat of the intercoastal water of the GTM NER in this region. So there's long areas where there's direct interaction between the intercoastal and these basically unhardened natural shorelines. And I think that they are so long that it's kind of infeasible to have most of that be, no wake zones. And so I think essentially what the Army Corps is really considering now is to sustain the navigation function of these channels and to reduce the amount of long-term dredging that we need to do, because essentially they're pulling out sediments that sloughed off the marshes and are now in the middle of the channel. Like, that's what's causing the dredging to be so expensive, is to instead reallocate those funds for semi-permeable barriers and other types of wave dissipation structures that allow for the basically sustain the navigation function, but reduce the marsh loss. And so I think those are just investment decisions that need to be made. And hopefully some of the science that's being generated by Sam's group about, basically the value of these habitats, these high vulnerability areas, will help shed some light on where we might prioritize those types of investments. Yeah.
Thank you. James asked, do the land ownership issues in the salt marsh have any relationship to Spanish land grants?
So, James, I don't know enough about this, and I wish the gentleman who is so knowledgeable about property ownership at our workshop could answer that question for you. So I'm naive and can't give you a correct answer about that, but it was surprising to me at just how actually common this type of sort of private ownership of these intertidal landscapes are, particularly in this region. So we weren't anticipating a challenge associated with that. And we were really glad that it came out of our workshop, because permitting would have ended up in an entirely different arena if we were trying to work on state lands versus, kind of publicly or privately owned lands. Yeah. But if anybody on the call has any other things to add there or any other local knowledge, I'd be interested. Yeah, Jessica, I can see you on, maybe you can offer some ideas. I don't know if I can't hear you, Jessica.
Jessica, you might be muted still. We see your microphone is unmuted, but we cannot hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yep.
Got it. Okay, I just had to switch the source on that. So the city is unique in that we were in existence before the state. And so we have a lot of the bottomlands. So it makes it somewhat easier in some cases when we're working on for like a city project. We're not necessarily having to deal with the sovereign submerged lands rules. But there are cases where there's a lot of private property that has been deeded through the years. And so to Christine's point, JB Miller, who's on board with the city, he's our land manager for the Fish Island property. He's really probably the foremost authority when it comes to understanding some of the complications from that. And so for part of the property where the subject area is located is state acquired lands that the city's maintaining. So it is complicated. So if you wanted more information, I'm happy to connect you with JB. So just reach out and let me know. I'll put my email address in the chat.
Thank you, Jessica. Our next question is the boat traffic or wake data for the area publicly accessible?
The AIS data is publicly accessible. So yeah, you can absolutely have access to that. These new data that are coming from this kind of our derived layer, we can absolutely make that available to anyone. And we probably should think about, Abby, making it available, through the monitoring data or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. I think it'd be useful, particularly in these small tidal creeks, which, are harder to get at. And so, we did the best we could. It's not perfect, but I think that it could be valuable in some ways to think about those areas and their boat wakes. So yeah, but the AIS data along the main intercoastal is absolutely publicly available.
Thank you. There's another question. Is there any issue with public perception regarding using funding to restore or protect areas that are under private ownership?
So I think that at this time, honestly, because we were unaware of the private ownership when we went and applied for this project, and I would be really curious about particularly, Jessica's perception and thoughts about this too. You're right, in these intertidal locations where these lands are not going to be developed there's not going to be a home put on them or anything. The idea of potentially restoring these landscapes or, putting them in, and maybe I'm probably speaking out of my my knowledge, but of what I'm really knowledgeable about, but putting them in something like conservation easement so that we could do restoration types of activities on that would have broader community benefits seems like a good strategy thinking ahead, especially in locations where there may be actually relatively large areas of restorable habitat that are under such ownership. So, but yeah, Jessica, I'm curious what you would have to say here.
Yeah, so I think when we get further into nailing down the site-specific applications and the actual techniques that we think we can use, that's, the permitting obviously comes into play, which is tied to the ownership. And so we would need to have those conversations with the property owners to see if they would be willing to work with the partners in the city on any type of like a private public partnership type of thing. We really haven't done community engagement on this per se, but at some point that is a question that does come up. As an example, we have a separate city project that we're doing that we need to build infrastructure on private lands. And so that is dealing with individual property owners and their willingness to grant easements for construction to be able to put in this infrastructure. And it's, there's then different perspectives on that. And so each project and location is going to be different. So we're going to be, I think, learning as we go through these various projects, but it's a great question.
Thank you. Any additional questions for Dr. Angelini or Dr. Chapman? Time for maybe one more. Well, seeing none, I'd like to give a big virtual round of applause to our presenters, Dr. Chapman and Dr. Angelini. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and these exciting efforts. We're looking forward to seeing how these projects play out. I do have a quick survey that I will open right here. It should launch as a poll. So if you could go ahead and just answer 3 quick questions, we would really appreciate it. It will help us plan for the rest of the series. So our next webinar, it will be on Tuesday, January 18th in 2022. Registration will open in early January. If you have any questions, my contact information is located on the GTM website, and I will go ahead and pop another link into the chat box with the website where registration information will be, as well as the themes for our future webinars. So thank you again for everyone joining us today. Thank you for taking our quick poll, and again, thank you to Dr. Chapman and Dr. Angelini for their wonderful presentations today. And we hope to see everyone at our next webinar in January and next year.